Right, we'll just give it another 30 seconds and then we'll begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anu Singh, and I'm Deputy Director at Carnegie India. Welcome to 2021's first edition of the Anahita Women's Speaker Series, hosted jointly by Carnegie India and the Vedika Scholars Program for Women. To tell you a little bit about ourselves, Carnegie India is a New Delhi-based think tank, part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have analysis and research in three areas: security studies, technology and society, and political economy. This research has perhaps become even more significant at this time of global crisis, where so many of our previous assumptions are being debunked. So perhaps this is the time then for us to rethink, reimagine, and even re-aspire. And this also is the context for the relevance of the Anahita Speaker Series. In this series, we have the privilege of hosting a woman leader who has excelled in her field to share her professional and personal journey. What makes it even more special is that she is in conversation with a younger woman at the threshold of her career. With this, I now hand over to Rupa Vasudev to introduce the Vedika Scholars Program, our speaker for today and the run of event. Rupa.
Thank you, Anu, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Carnegie India and the Vedika Scholars, the Anahita Speaker Series. Let me first give you a brief introduction of Vedika before I introduce our very special speaker for today. The Vedika Scholars Program for Women is an 18-month full-time residential program with a reimagined curriculum that has been carefully crafted to the expectations of employers today. The program's mission is to prepare women with potential to achieve fulfilling careers and create a cadre of successful women professionals for the 21st century to crack the proverbial glass ceiling. Vedika recognizes and leverages the importance of diversity. It is committed to women reaching their full professional potential. Today we introduce to you Pavithra Suryanarayan, who is Assistant Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, with a PhD in Political Science for Columbia University. Her research is motivated by the desire to understand how different forms of group-based inequality, class or status, for instance, shape political behavior and institutions in multi-ethnic countries like India and the United States. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, Le Monde, The Economist, and The Hindu, amongst others, and have won discipline-wide awards. Pavithra is also an editor and contributor to Broad Street, an interdisciplinary academic blog on historical political economy. She's currently working on a book manuscript on hollowing out the state. A very warm welcome to you, Pavithra, and thank you for being with us today. My colleague Priyanka will be the moderator this evening. Priyanka is Assistant Manager at the Vedika Writing and Communication Center. Over to you, Priyanka, and I hope you have a lovely evening, all of you.
Thank you so much, Rupa. Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome Pavithra and thank her for joining us today. Before I begin, a small note to the audience, whether you're streaming on Zoom or YouTube, please make sure to type in your questions and we will take those questions in the last 30 minutes of our session. Our today's discussion is not just valuable for people who keep their eye out for US politics, but all of us in general. If you remember the fact that US, being the powerhouse of modernism and a hegemon on the world stage, can have a ripple effect on worldwide politics with respect to whatever is going on within its borders. So political science, I believe, is a very important tool to study how this politics unfolds, the very power structures. And not just that, but it also helps us understand the social fabrics of society and its meaning. So, my first question to you, Pavithra, would be how did you develop an interest in political science and the respective interest areas that you're pursuing right now?
Well, thank you, Priyanka, and thank you everyone for having me on this series. I'm really honored to be invited and to have this conversation with you today. I have to start by saying my journey to political science wasn't a linear one. You know, my undergraduate degree was in business and economics. I spent several years in journalism. I worked at The Economist Intelligence Unit. I worked at CNBC. And I had always thought to work in possibly government or in policymaking. And so I started off my graduate training by doing a master's in public policy. And it was at that point in Berkeley, California, that I fell in love with political science and realized that that's where my passion lay, and decided to do a PhD. In terms of how I ended up studying what I study, it was a class at Columbia University when I was doing my PhD with an American politics professor called Ira Katznelson. It was a 2-semester, year-long class on American political development. Now, American political development is a way political scientists in the US study institutions and the role of history in shaping how countries' political trajectories evolve. And, you know, over the course of the year, as I started to learn about America's journey from its independence to the current day, I started to see a lot of parallels between America's story and India's story. And the course on American political development under Ira Katznelson focused a lot on, you know, 2 strains in America: the liberal, freedom-oriented strain, and then the persistent strain of race. You know, that divide between Blacks and whites in the US in shaping America's politics and institutions. And it resonated a lot with me as somebody who works on India, that we have the same sort of histories. On the one hand, we have a population that deeply cares about politics and democracy and freedom and expression, but then we also have that history of the caste system in India that continues to play on how our politics and our institutions develop. And so this encounter with American politics made me curious about a lot of questions on the role of caste in India's political development, particularly India's institutional development. And that's how I ended up studying what I do.
I couldn't agree with you more, because I feel that the movements like Black Lives Matter sort of emerged in America once again with a powerful uprising. Similarly, I think where the conversation about caste, which was more or less not there in Indian context for a really long time, suddenly emerged. And you have a lot of people also writing about Dalit Lives Matters once again. So I definitely love the parallel. But do you see the change in terms of American classroom? Do you see more diversity with respect to your own university days?
So, you know, the past 4 years of being in America have been really interesting. I think in 2016, nobody really expected Donald Trump to win. And, you know, I remember being in my classroom on Wednesday morning, the day after the election in 2016 in November. I was teaching a class on comparative politics. And, you know, there were 50 students in my lecture, and the students looked shell-shocked. They couldn't believe what had happened in the elections. And, you know, these were 20-something youngsters, and they were trying to process what was going on with the election of President Trump. And it was a very important moment to teach Americans about democracy, and to teach Americans about democracy being something more than just elections. It's about the strength of institutions, the care and protection of norms, about how we treat each other, and the importance of law and constitutional principles. So I would say my classes have definitely changed in the last 4 years. I don't take things for granted in how I talk to Americans about democracy or politics. And I find myself teaching them a lot of things that I normally teach my classes on the politics of India. So I find all of my knowledge on how to think about politics comes from India is very useful to talking to Americans about American politics. In terms of diversity, I do see a change. I do see institutional level changes in how much people care about what to talk to, how to diversify their classrooms, how to diversify the faculty, but also how to talk to students about a range of issues. So diversity has emerged not just in terms of who the students are and who is hired on the faculty, but actually what the curriculum covers and whose words and ideas we're reading. So there's more thought, I think, amongst faculty about including minority voices, women's voices when they develop syllabi. And I think that's definitely something that's happened as a backlash to Trump's election, which in itself was seen as a form of backlash, So I think these are good things that have happened in American academia.
Yes, yes. But diversity is also, I think, is being used as a token word nowadays. To a certain extent, people are actually acknowledging it, welcoming it, but to a certain extent, it's just being taken up for surface value. Now, coming to the bull's eye of our discussion, Biden's cabinet, he has done all the, as a nod to all the support that he got, he has introduced a lot of different backgrounds within his cabinet. And do you think, on the other hand, you also talk about that the current politics makes you think about hollowing of the state, the current manuscript that you're working on, and the institutional weakening. So do you think this, the diversity that is being, brought into the discourse is going to help that, or what do you think?
So let me take this in two parts. First, let me tell you guys about what my book is about. My book is about this idea that, elites in some countries, seeing the possibility that they're going to lose power, try to weaken the state's bureaucratic apparatus. And what do I mean by that? They go after, important bureaucratic agencies, whether it's the tax agency or it's the census, or the postal service as it is in the US. And why do they do this? They do this because they understand that, they're likely to lose power soon. And they want to make sure that the state that they give to the groups that then come into power are so weak that they can't achieve anything. And principally, they can't achieve things like, big welfare programs or redistribution. So I describe this process of hollowing out the state, which I see happens a lot in countries with very extreme forms of inequality, particularly racial or caste-based inequality. And so to now your question, Priyanka, we did see this hollowing out under the Trump administration, and it happened at a staggering level, right? And you saw the Trump administration really weaken the State Department, the Labor Department, the Census Department, the environmental agencies, the tax agencies. So the Biden administration right now has a very sort of weakened bureaucracy that they have to fix immediately. And so from that perspective, I feel the Biden administration has hit the ground running. And it has done so by bringing on board a number of old hands, people who already know how to run these agencies, who have an institutional memory of what these agencies did and how they should function. And he's drawn extensively from people who worked in the Obama era. Now, part two about diversifying the cabinet or diversifying, his top lieutenants that he has hired to do the job. I would flip the question, Priyanka. How can you have something efficient if all you have are white men running it, right? That means you're explicitly not looking at merit. You are the one looking at identity if you're picking a certain kind of person to always run the job. To me, a diversified cabinet actually speaks to the fact that he's going where the expertise is. He doesn't care if the expertise is with a woman or a Hispanic person or a Black person. He is going to find the people who are the best people for the job. And I think the cabinet reflects the fact that the best person for the job can look like anybody. So I think diversity and expertise are very much hand in hand, because you're giving the job to somebody who excels at what they do. And to us, the question should be, why is it that some countries tend to privilege certain groups? How can you have expertise and talent if you're always hiring the same kind of person?
True. In fact, my follow-up question for you was going to be about identity politics once again, but I think you very much answered that. The point was that how American liberalism is becoming open to the idea of identity politics. And while people criticize its merit, and a lot of people have written different things about it, some people say that it's almost a savior for American liberalism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I want to take that in two ways, right? We don't think of it as identity politics when upper castes in large numbers vote for the BJP, or white Americans in large proportions vote for the Republican Party. We only think of it as identity politics when we see lower castes picking lower caste politicians, or Blacks picking the Democratic Party or choosing Black Lives Matter. So I think you have to understand that in places like the US and India, we've always had identity politics, but that was the dominant form of politics. But when we see low-ranked groups or subaltern groups do the same behaviors that have always existed, we think of it as identity politics. So I would say, identity politics has always been in these countries. And it just takes on a much more explicit and overt form now, because you see it more obviously with the behavior of new groups that have now, aspired to come into power. And I don't think you can escape the fact that these countries have identity politics, precisely because these groups are so unequal, right? And this is at the heart of it. A good amount of my research shows, even in India, that you have less caste politics or less religious politics if you have less inequality between castes across the states, right? So states where there's less inequality between different jatis or different castes, you have less tendency for people to vote along their caste lines. And the same is true for the US. So I think identity politics is symptomatic of other kinds of issues in a society, prominently inequality. And until those core issues go away, you're going to see this play a very important and sort of persistent role in how people think about who to vote for and how to advance their interests in politics.
Right. My next question to you would be about, of course, the recent elections. And there has been, it is said that there has been a change in voter turnout, and you have worked on it in depth about the voter inequality and relation with taxation. So what do you think about this change, people voting in large numbers especially? So what are your ideas on that?
So first, let me tell you a little bit about the research that I've done on this. So one of the things, I observed with another co-author of mine at Columbia University is that, there is a dominant thinking in political science that rich people vote more than poor people, right? But then you guys know from Indian politics as a very important case that that's not true in India. The poor people take their vote just as seriously as the wealthy. They come out in large numbers on election day, and they really express their, political motivation by voting on election day. And as we dug into thinking about this more deeply, we found that the US is really the extreme case here. In the US, there's a huge difference between the propensity of wealthy people to show up to vote versus poor. The wealthy people come out in much greater numbers than poor people. And so we wanted to understand, why is this happening? Why is there this difference between some countries where wealthy people vote more, and then other countries where poor people vote more, or at least just as much as wealthy people. And our answer to this sort of seeming puzzle is that the wealthy people come to vote when they fear politics has consequences. And a big part of politics having consequences is taxation. So in countries where, the wealthy people don't really think anything will change dramatically from politics from one party to another, they tend to abstain because they don't even care about what the politics portends, right? And so from that perspective, we found that, when the state can tax and, really shake down wealthy people, they come to guard their interests in the polling booth. Now, what makes this particular election really interesting from a turnout perspective? You guys would have read, this was a bumper turnout. And it was a bumper turnout just for Biden, who won. It was a bumper turnout also for Trump. Both candidates crossed the 70 million mark, right? Biden crossed the 80 million votes mark. And so what was unusual about this particular election? Well, the ways in which voting was encouraged. And this was a real eye-opener for Americans, right? So this time they allowed people advanced voting, absentee voting, mail-in voting, all of which served to improve, the voting of poor and marginalized groups in politics. So you see that the Democratic Party really benefited when its constituents, many of who are poor or middle-class voters, were given access to the vote. So it holds a lot of lessons for us about how to improve political participation by, democratizing the way in which people can access voting. And so that really teaches us about these kinds of small innovations governments can make to improve turnout. And, the Republican Party turned out too, because they knew this election would have consequences. Trump's tax cuts were in question. All the policies that Trump undertook were in question. So people were motivated on the right-wing side as well to show up. So it was a very interesting election from that perspective, a bumper turnout election.
Yes, yes. And going back to the point that you mentioned, this polarity between urban liberal voters and then conservatives, it's almost like their opposition, their voter turnout is like completely to show the other one down, and not exactly for the same side. Especially for the conservative, they definitely don't want the urban liberal ideology to sort of pollute their country. To that, I know you've also written on PR system, where you also talk about that there are not just these two factions, there are also traditional Republicans who are different from Trump faction. So how do you think the Trump supporters, then Republican conservative who are different from Trump supporters, and then urban liberal voters, all of these, how will they sort of come into the PR system as opposed to the FPTP system, which is in America right now? And can we even think of them sharing an office, given how outspoken they are against each other's ideology? And will it be like summoning them to principal's office?
So for the audience who might not be familiar with these terminologies, let me just describe what America's elections look like. America's elections look a lot like India's elections, right? A bunch of people compete in an electoral constituency. There they call it the, district, right? The congressional district. And whoever gets the most votes wins the entire district. So just like India, they have what is called the first past the post system. Your MLA or MP in India is selected based on whichever candidate gets the most votes, you win that district. And same in the US with, their congressional seats are determined that way, and their electoral college votes in every state is also determined by this winner take all system. And so what does that do? I think what that does is typically it creates a two-party system, which somehow India has managed to dodge based on the very specifics of, India's very large multi-ethnic federal politics. the US very much looks like what a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post system should look like, which is it privileges the emergence of two parties. Because, you know, if you have a third or fourth party, they end up spoiling the vote. And so, you know, over time, you've had these two parties, Republicans and Democrats, who have come to be the standard bearers of politics, right? And so what it does is it creates very uneasy coalitions within the people who support these parties. So on, you know, the right-wing side, it's a mix of people who want right-wing economics, which is low taxes, growth-oriented policies. But it also has people who are anti-immigration, people who we think of as racially intolerant, and people who have this whole mentality of America first and America for white Americans, right? The Democratic Party on the other side has, you know, a mix of people who are very much about left-wing economic policies, but they're also people who want pro-immigration. They are people who want, you know, diverse country as the coalition, and they're people who really care about, you know, liberal values from the perspective of, you know, people's freedoms in terms of who they want to be, right? So you have these sort of coalitions that emerge. So naturally, the parties are always pulled, you know, this way or that way by the different types of groups that support them. So now you're seeing the Republican Party in real trouble. And it's going to be very obvious if you're going to follow the impeachment proceedings that are underway right now in the US. You know, there's a group of Republicans who want to see Trump impeached. And there's a large group of Republicans who still continue to support him, which speak to real tensions within the party about what the party wants to be. Does it want to be a traditional Republican Party, which is about, you know, conservative social values and conservative economic values? Or is it a party that is very anti-immigration, you know, America first kind of politics that Trump has advanced? And it's a big tension. And I've written, you know, pieces on how to think about a thought experiment if America could move from a first-past-the-post to a PR system. Each of these kinds of strains would have its own party. Right? This is how a lot of Western Europe looks like. You have the Green Party, you have Social Democrats, you have conservatives, you have the Christian Party, and you have all these different strains that can have their own party, which is not possible right now because of America's electoral system. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens to the Republican Party. And if, in my view, if the Republicans are not able to overcome the Trump wing of the party, America is in real trouble because the Trump wing of the party doesn't even believe in democracy. It just wants to see itself in power. And that's a really, really troubling thing to have a long-standing democracy experience.
Right, right. And, you know, you already touched upon this to a great extent, how, you know, the allegiance of the upper caste, which you have actually written in an Indian context, about how poor people vote the right wing, how, you know, the allegiance is built from the idea that, you know, we want to gain back the power, although we are economically weak. Ethnically, we want to still be the superior. The idea of superiority and inferiority, I think that term you mentioned in your paper. So in comparing that to, once again, to America from, you know, race angle rather than caste, do you think that, you know, this right wing sentiment of this allegiance also holds in America, one, and second, is it sort of an alienation from the urban liberal discourse? Because I feel that a lot of criticism of modernism and urban liberalism is also that it is very alienating to a certain extent. So do you think it's driven by that?
So, you know, I would say that America absolutely looks like India from this perspective. So I have a paper on, you know, the rise of the BJP's vote share after Mandal. And I show that, you know, historically, using the 1930 census, talukas and assembly constituencies in which Brahmins were more dominant in the 1930s were exactly the places where the BJP gained votes after the Mandal issue in 1990. At a very granular level, you can see that, you know, the rise of the BJP was a backlash to claims around affirmative action, which really, you know, go to the heart of thinking about upper caste dominance in India is the upper caste dominance in education and its control of important positions in the government, right? And so affirmative action in higher education and government really generated this backlash. And what is fascinating is that there's very similar work on the US. And in the US, people have shown that in 2010 and 2012, the rise of the Tea Party, which was seen as a backlash to Obama, was the greatest, where historically in 1860, there were more slaves. So there's a legacy effect of places where you have this high inequality between groups that continues to play in how parties are able to persuade poor voters to come on board their agenda. So poor Brahmins in India and poor upper castes in India and poor whites in the US are persuaded because of their, historical role and how they think about their position in society in supporting certain groups. And that's the fact in both the US and in India. Now, your question on urban and rural differences. Now, here I think India and the US diverge. In the US, what has happened over time is the way in which people sort themselves geographically, and by that I mean where people choose to live and what they choose to do, has grown more and more and more segregated over time. So you have this moment now where rural voters in America are also extremely conservative socially, are also extremely intolerant racially, are mostly white, and are mostly Republican, right? Whereas the cities of America are much more diverse. You have, yes, they are, democratic bastions because they're more diverse, but they also have substantial numbers of Republicans who live in them. And so the cities are this very, very diverse pool of voters, whereas the rural countryside in the US has started to look more and more and more and more similar to itself with a very specific kind of characteristics. And again, I think this bodes bad for politics, right? So this kinds of patterns of geographic sorting and segregation means that all kinds of things are overlapping with each other, which means you're never going to be persuaded to vote for the other party. And that is bad for politics. I think India, that's not the case yet. You still have a great deal more diversity, both in rural India as much as in urban India. And hopefully, that's a positive thing for Indian politics, where people are more keen to reach across the aisle and work with each other and sort out problems, and persuaded to vote for opposing parties because of that inherent diversity.
Yes, absolutely. I had a quick question, but I think we have to move on to the audience part of the questions. All right. So we have a question from Anya. She has written a question. Okay, is there a benefit in thinking about or comparing systems of oppression like race and caste with each other? I'm thinking especially about Isabel Wilkerson's recent book. It uses the language of caste to talk about systematic racism in US and white supremacy in Nazi Germany, as well as Black Dalit solidarity movements. Is there any space for a global race-caste dialogue?
Well, thank you for that really great question. I mean, as a start, I'd encourage you to read some of my work, which is on my website, which is really making this comparison very directly. And I absolutely think there's great analytical sort of benefits in thinking about racial politics and caste politics through the same lens. And the reason I think that is both of these are systems of birth-based rank, right? And when we think about rank, we typically think about class, which is some people are wealthy, some people are poor. And the thing about class dynamics or economic dynamics is a poor person can become wealthy in their lifetime, or a wealthy person can become poor in their lifetime. But the difference between a class-based ranking and a birth-based ranking system is that you can't change your caste status or your racial status over the course of your lifetime, whatever you do. And so I do think these sort of ranked ethnic systems, whether it's race in the US or caste in India, create certain peculiar types of politics. And comparing the US and India case really illustrates that. Over and over again, you see this strain of caste and race emerge in shaping how people behave and what parties they vote for and what kind of policies they prefer. And Isabel Wilkerson's book is like a wonderful sort of introduction into thinking about analogizing caste across the world. And beyond the case of Nazi Germany and the US, you can think about apartheid in South Africa. You can think about racial politics in Brazil. You can think about, racial politics in places like Singapore and Malaysia, where again, you have these sort of rank distinctions between groups. And I think there's tremendous analytical utility in thinking about this broadly.
All right. So my next question is from the audience. I recently read a report that stated that a lot of Indian Americans that voted for the Democratic Party support the right-wing government here in India. How does that happen?
Okay, so this was, I don't know if you were in the talk that Milan Vaishnav, Devesh Kapoor, and Sumitra Badrinathan gave yesterday at my school at the SAIS in Washington, D.C., but that's precisely what they find. They find, well, first they find that Indian Americans tend to be largely Democratic Party voters. Two, Indian Americans tend to largely have a positive view of the BJP and Narendra Modi, but it's not as positive a view of Prime Minister Modi as Indians themselves have of Prime Minister Modi. And three, they find that Republican Party Indian Americans tend to be even more supportive of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP than Democratic Party. But four, both these groups are broadly supportive of the right-wing government in India. And, you're not probably, Indian Americans are not going to like what I say about this, but to me, a lot of how they think about India is shaped by their own class and caste interests. Indian Americans tend to be wealthier. Indian Americans tend to be upper caste. And so my sense is they have a different view of Prime Minister Modi, who they see as somebody who is going up against corruption and criminality in India, who they see as being someone who privileges, liberal economic policies, and they see him as taking on, identity politics in India. And so it's unsurprising to me that they have this view on the one hand in the US and a different one in India, because in the US, they are the minority. In India, they are the high rank group. So, of course, they have these different political preferences, and it's unsurprising to me.
I absolutely agree with you. In fact, I feel that a lot of nostalgia is attached, and of course, the residue is nationalistic feelings that come up when they think about the nation. And this has, like you mentioned, culminated into a strange political atmosphere for them. So the next question from the audience is by Anupam Khanna. How significant are voter suppression efforts in the US, both explicit administrative hurdles as well as intimidation on site and increasing economic cost of voting for poor communities?
Okay, this is an excellent question. And I would say this, I think, should be the number one priority of the Biden administration, which is a new version of the Voting Rights Act. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar, but since the 1960s, America had a strong, robust federal oversight of voting in the American states, precisely because, past systems of Jim Crow in the American South had made it so hard for Black Americans to vote. And that was the state of affairs for like 4 decades. And starting in around 2010, that was rolled back. The key features of the Voting Rights Act have been eliminated. And since then, you have seen a spate of laws around the states to make it harder for people to vote. Things like voter ID laws, difficulty in implementing mail-in voting. And just in the past few weeks, I think 3 dozen laws are in the process of being adjudicated and debated in the state assemblies across the US, making it harder for people to vote. Because like I said, the elections made it very clear that when you make it easier to vote, more poor people and more Democratic Party voters vote and express their political participation. And so the confusing thing for me as an India scholar is, why doesn't the US have an independent election commission like we do in India? And the US doesn't have this. It leaves it to the states as a part of its federal feature to control their own election agenda. And so I think voter suppression is a #1 issue for the Democratic Party, because if they don't solve that issue, they're going to keep losing elections, because rules are going to be made in such a way as to make it hard for Democratic Party voters to show up to vote. And I really hope the Biden administration will take this on to fix it and introduce a new form of the Voting Rights Act on a federal level to make it hard for states to introduce this kind of voter suppression in the elections. And so I think, to answer more clearly Anupam's question, it's a significant problem in the US, and one that I hope that they will be tackling very soon.
Yes, and I think you also mentioned something about how before the elections, when the Trump administration was still in its stronghold, there were a lot of surveys that were going around where they were trying to identify nationalities, and once again the deportation efforts were doubled. So I guess all of that leads to increasing the voter count for the Republican Trump supporters.
Well, see, I wouldn't necessarily connect immigration to voting yet. It's a long slog from being admitted to the US, to then being given a legitimate green card, to then being able to make it to a citizen, right? It's not such a linear route that you'd end up in America and you get a vote, right? It takes a long time to get there. So on the one hand, it's true, more lax immigration over time likely will increase support for the party that supports immigration, which might be the Democrats. But historically, that role has been played by Republicans. If you look at the 1990s or even early 2000s, Latino voters overwhelmingly supported, George Bush into power. And in part because Republicans have held the more open view on immigration in the past, because they are, the pro-economic liberals. They see immigration, they used to see immigration as a way to spur America's economic growth and productivity. That has changed as we think about Republicans now as being this America first, ultra-nationalist kind of party. And so, it's not clear to me that immigrants would always prefer one party or the other. Parties' policies have an effect on how immigrants start to perceive them. And I think somebody in the audience asked this question. I think Anupam Khanna has a question there about, Black and Latino votes increasing for the Republican Party. More than Black voters, Latino voters are very susceptible to Republican appeals, because they have historically been courted by Cuban Republican, leaders in places like Florida to vote for them. So these things are not as set in stone.
Yes. I meant the post-election, the narrative of when they were trying to look for the explanation as to why they lost. So some things that you heard within this discussion was that it's because the outsiders voted. It's not really the actual Americans. So I think those terms were being circulated to a certain extent.
I want to make a strong plea to anybody in the audience to not believe that America's elections were in any way bungled or in any way about, voters who shouldn't be voting. That did not happen. And if anything, this election has received so much scrutiny. There've been over 60 lawsuits by the Trump administration, scores of appeals, and none of them have held. And so if anything, this was one of the most watched elections of our lifetimes. And there has been no evidence that there was any kind of, faulty voting of people who shouldn't vote, dead people voting, or immigrants without papers. No, none of that happened. So really, this is a narrative that people who lose elections might feel better telling themselves, but that didn't happen.
All right, so we have a similar question from the audience. What are some of the consequences of hollowing out of the state? You mentioned how the Trump administration led to weakening of some state institutions. How will that affect America's progress?
So this is a great question. So one of the things I study historically, and it's just one of those moments. I'm a historical political economy person, so my book actually focuses on 1920 India and 1870 United States. So I compare the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in India in 1920 to the end of the Civil War in the US to study hollowing out the state. So it just so happened that as I'm writing this book, real world events, both in India and the US, are starting to resemble their historical counterparts, right? So what does my work tell me? When you hollow out the state, what you really go for are important building blocks to state capacity. It's the state's ability to collect good information about its citizens. So it's things like the census. It's the state's ability to go after taxpayers. So it's things like the Internal Revenue Service. And it's the state's ability to then make tax offenders or people who don't comply. So it's oftentimes, the coercive arm of the state. So what do I expect has happened under the Trump administration? So first thing is, we still don't know how good the census is going to be from 2020. 2020 was an important year for the country in the US because it was the decennial census in the US. And in the US, that census, just like India, is really important because it feeds data into the size of congressional districts or the number of congressional districts a state gets. It determines the amount of welfare spending different states will get, because welfare in the states is not about citizen, it's about residents, right? So even people who don't vote should be able to get enough of the state federal government's funding resources. So that's a very important part. The other thing that we don't know is how damaged things like the United States Citizen Services and the State Department are, which are really important to immigration processing, right? Again, it determines who becomes a citizen and who's allowed in the US. And the third is, and this to me is the core of what I study, we don't know how devastated the Internal Revenue Service is. For years, the Trump government has starved funding to staff bureaucrats in the IRS, which is the tax agency, which means you can't go after the big tax dodgers. And you can see that over time, this has pummeled the ability of the US to make its big tax dodgers pay their taxes. Again, is going to be really crucial, because then you can't have good welfare programs if you can't collect taxes, right? So I would watch out for these three key areas to gain more information in the coming 6 months about what has happened with the bureaucracies in these areas, which I think of as hollowing out the state. Because if you weaken all of these, you can't do any of the things I just described, right? So this, I think, are the critical areas. And I hope the Biden administration is smart enough to pay particular attention to fixing these areas.
Okay. So our next question is from Mahir. This political divide in America is quite deep today. What do you think is the way forward for the current government in terms of dealing with the issue?
Mahir, this is the $1 million question, right? So the US is, I think, in the throes of not just partisanship, it's in the throes of what we think of as negative partisanship, which is they hate the other side as much as they love their own side. And so the dislike for the other is often the motivation for sticking with your own party, even though your party might be doing bad things, right? And this is a huge challenge for the Biden administration. And so far, Biden's instincts have been good. He's talked a lot about uniting the country and unifying it. And I think the way forward is to show good performance. Ultimately, I think Americans are smart in that they think about their pocketbook concerns. They think about Am I doing better than I was doing last year? Is my family doing better than it was doing 5 years ago? And so I think here the instincts of the Biden government is to have that big $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, to have, good solid minimum wage laws, to provide, good healthcare. I think that's the way forward. Win people with good policies, even if you can't win them through, ideology, I think is the only way forward. Show performance and show that you deserve to be in office.
But in terms of ideology, do you think there is any possibility, because it's not just at the American front, but also at Indian front that we see this polarity? Do you ever see a reconciling point for both of these parties?
It's a hard question. I mean, just as I've made this argument about performance, you could flip it on me and say, well, the Modi government didn't show much of a performance between 14 to 19 and they still won elections. So, I agree with you that there's a strong role of ideology here in how, people are voting. And it's not just in India or the US. You're seeing this in Brazil. You're seeing this, in Israel. You're seeing this in the UK. It seems to me that we're in a moment of populism and right-wing ideology gaining ascendance across the world. And I think in part it's a response to the government having failed to deliver on performance. So I feel, in India, you could have a reckoning of the BJP if the opposition could get its act together and show performance, which hasn't happened. So I think the Indian story is as much a story of the opposition in disarray as it is about ideology. Whereas in the US, that's not the case. The Democrats really got their act together. They put together a strong electoral campaign, and now they're already showing signs that they want to deliver. They want to deliver on policy. And so I think this is how you do it. You do it by being very focused on giving people good policies.
Yes. Okay, so we have one question from a Vedika scholar, Kushali's question. How close is the US in losing its hegemonic power, considering the state of the country after its Capitol Hill violence, and its democracy is in a very sensitive stage?
I agree. But one thing that's useful is, as a scholar who studies things from a historical perspective, is this is not the first time it's happened in the US. The US has had multiple presidential assassinations. The US has been through an intensive civil war. The US has been through decades of being an authoritarian regime in the American South to its Black Americans. And so the US has this, double movement within it. It proceeds very fast in one direction and often goes back in the other direction, but it finds its way forward. So I wouldn't yet call it the death of American hegemony. I think, that American impulse to overcome and find itself back on top very much still exists. And it exists in the very diverse and optimistic coalition that's put Biden into power. So let's wait and watch.
Kushali has a follow-up, also very utopian, but is there a possibility that an independent can take hold in US politics, bridging the Republicans and Democrats?
So this would be interesting, right? That Trump himself has said he wants to start the Patriot Party. And it'll be curious to see if he does. I doubt it'll happen because, like I said, the first past the post system really pressures people to stay in the lane of two parties because, it's very hard for a third independent to break through and convince voters that he or she can actually win an election or gain the funding that you need to run for elections or build, the necessary cadre of politicians going down to local, county, then district, then state and national elections in the US, right? So it's a hard thing to do, but if ever there was a time, it's now with Trump making those threats. So it's possible. And then we'll have to see how quickly the Republican Party elites react, whether they give in to him, or whether they push for a move from the first pass to like a PR system to solve this.
But I absolutely agree with you. I think when you come back to the Indian politics, when Arvind Kejriwal, who is Delhi CM, sort of entered the politics on a very on a people's level, in media coverage, he got a lot of support, and he almost contested national level elections, and he thought he'll win it. But of course, that was not the reality. For him, taking strong hold of Delhi was eventually became much more important, because you start realizing it, when you think about why BJP keeps mentioning Congress again and again. It's the fact that Congress, although they are not as popular as they seem, they still have, especially in the rural areas, a lot of people just vote for Congress,
Yeah.
instantly. So you are absolutely right. I think it takes a lot of time and effort to get to that level. So
and I think the answer is in your comment here, Priyanka, which is that if there is a role for independence in the US, it's at the very local level. So it's unsurprising that there are independent senators in the US who put independent in their party label, right? But this is the kind of stuff that happens at the congressional district level, or at the local county elections level, or possibly even at the state level. It's very hard for like a national level candidate to break through and win a presidential election. So if enough numbers of independents emerge simultaneously across the US, maybe you'll find a change in the US. But that hasn't happened, not for a long time, not since like the populist parties of the 19th century, right? So we have to wait and see.
All right. So that was our last question from the audience. Thank you so much, Pavithra. It's been a pleasure to discuss everything around whether it's US election and also coming over to the Indian politics. And definitely there are parallels, and it was a great discussion for me. Over to you, Anu.
Thank you, Priyanka and Pavithra. This was fascinating. I have been sort of been off video, but I've been watching and listening unblinkingly. And if there's time, I have a question for you, because
of course.
I have you, right? So it is, I'm fascinated by how in India, liberals have almost become a caste. They have been castigated and made into a caste, tribe, call it what you will. We know Modi's electoral successes have in a way demonstrated his ability to ride over caste to some extent and make religion the unifying point, right? And on the other hand, liberals are now a caste in themselves. And Pratap Bhanu Mehta, I'm sure you've read him. He has said that liberals have done themselves a disservice by the kind of ideology that they've held so far, at least in India. So my question, a very long-winded question this is, but it is that, do you think in India at least, there's been a death knell? Has it been struck for the liberal ideology as we knew it, at least, till recently? Because it doesn't seem to now have any legs anymore over here. I know that of course, in the US, maybe, sort of gong has been sounded, the Biden's election, etc. So the pushback has come. But do you see that in India, or will liberals have to reinvent themselves completely?
So, Anu, I would say two things. The first is, did it ever exist in India beyond what elites spoke about politics, right? What we gave as options to people in politics were a certain kind of politician. And so what we're observing right now is, I think, a connection between what the voters have always been like versus now what the politicians look like, right? And I think that's the change that's happened, is that the character and the type of politician has changed over time, not what sentiments or ideological dispositions existed in the Indian population. Now, I don't want to take away from the fact that there has been an explicit project on the part of the BJP to win people's hearts and minds through an ideology of Hindutva, or their, articulation of what they think India's culture and its political identity should be like. that has happened. And I think there's a fair point to be made that we don't have the antidote to that. We don't have a clear articulation of what the other side looks like. But I wouldn't call it the death of liberalism yet, right? And maybe that's because I come from Tamil Nadu, right? My state of DMK, AIA DMK, I think offers an antidote to what the BJP is offering at the national level. There's a very strong sense of inter-caste solidarity in Tamil Nadu. It still continues to be a strong welfare state, and being Tamil is more important than being, whatever caste you are or whatever religion you are. And there are laboratories like that in India. We just have to look for them. There are many states that have that antidote. So I feel like, these are large movements in history. We just need a leader and a party that can articulate those pockets of belief that exist in India in different forms. And so I do take exception to liberals being called a caste. That's not a caste. The caste and race have a very specific role in how they shape people's minds. So Pradap Banu might have a point that we don't have a compelling antidote to BJP's nationalism, but I wouldn't yet jump to calling liberals in themselves a caste yet.
No, you're absolutely right. The only thing I meant was that they've been sort of put into this bucket.
Right, a box, yeah, and labeled,
box.
Yeah.
Just, labeled, like castes are labeled, only in that way.
Absolutely, fair, really, that's fair.
Yeah, so thank you very much. This has been fascinating, really.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really great opportunity, especially to learn about the Vedika Scholars Program. I didn't know about it. So I'm going to tell everybody I know about it to look out for it and see what it's up to in the future. And I hope you're going to be sending PhD students to the US from the Vedika Scholars Program.
Pavithra, I'm sure everyone on the program has enjoyed listening to you as much as I have. So thank you for taking time out and being part of the program. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.